The gun was already pressed to Frederick Covington's temple when Pauline Whitaker made the decision that would unravel everything she had spent 6 years hiding. "Tell me where the deed is," growled Silas Drum, his thick fingers curled around the handle of a Colt single-action army revolver, the barrel leaving a cold ring against Frederick's skin. "Tell me, or I put this man in the ground right here in your parlor." Pauline stood perfectly still in the center of her small sitting room, the late afternoon light of a Nevada desert sun cutting through the dusty window in long amber blades. Her hands were raised. Her face showed nothing. That was the thing about Pauline Whitaker. She had learned, years before Frederick Covington ever rode into her life, that the best armor a woman could wear was the appearance of feeling nothing at all. But Frederick was looking at her, not with fear, not with the desperate, pleading eyes of a man begging to be saved. He was looking at her the way he had been looking at her since the day he arrived in Ridgeback, Nevada, with that open, searching, unbearable curiosity, as though she were a question he had not yet found the words to ask. "Pauline," Silas said, his voice dropping to something more dangerous than a shout, "I will not ask again." And in that moment, with Frederick Covington's calm eyes holding hers, with a gun at his head and 6 years of buried secrets suddenly pressing against the walls of her chest like floodwater against a dam, she made the choice. She told the truth, not the truth Silas wanted, a different one, a deeper one. She told it to Frederick. "The deed doesn't exist," she said quietly. "It never did. My father destroyed it the night before he died, because he knew what Silas would do if he ever got his hands on it." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Pauline had ever heard, and then Silas Drum made his fatal mistake. He turned his head toward her for just a half-second too long, and Frederick Covington, who was a great many things that Pauline had not yet had the chance to discover, proved himself to be a man who did not waste half-seconds. But that was not the beginning of the story. The beginning was 6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning in late October of 1882, when a stranger rode into Ridgeback on a gray mare and stopped in front of Whitaker's general store. Ridgeback was not a town that inspired warmth in newcomers. It sat at the edge of a wide, flat alkali basin in southern Nevada, with the spring mountains rising gray and indifferent to the west, and nothing much else in any other direction. The population hovered around 300 souls, give or take whoever had recently drunk themselves to death or been persuaded to leave by Silas Drum's hired men. There was a saloon, a livery, a sheriff's office that was mostly decorative, a church that held services every other Sunday, and Whitaker's general store, which Pauline had been running alone since her father died of a lung fever the previous winter. Frederick Covington dismounted slowly, the way a man does when he has been riding for many hours and is cataloging the damage to his body. He was tall, not dramatically so, but enough that his shadow stretched across the store's wooden porch at a considerable angle in the morning light. He wore a dark coat that had seen better decades, a wide-brimmed hat the color of old tobacco, and the kind of dusty, road-worn appearance that in the West either meant a drifter or a man with very serious business. He had dark brown hair and eyes that were an unusual shade, not quite green, not quite gray, but something in between that. Pauline, who had been watching through the store window with a cup of coffee in her hand and no particular patience for new arrivals, could not immediately categorize. He tied his mare to the post with the careful, unhurried precision of a man who respected animals, and then he came inside. The bell above the door rang. Pauline set down her coffee and assumed the expression she used for customers, polite, efficient, and entirely closed. "Morning," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, and there was something in the cadence of it that was not quite Western, a slight formality, like a man who had been educated somewhere east of the Mississippi and had spent years trying to file down the evidence of it. "Morning," she replied. "What do you need?" He looked around the store for a moment, the shelves of dry goods, the bolts of cloth, the hardware along the back wall, the glass case with the ammunition. He took it all in with a methodical sweep of those strange gray-green eyes, and then he looked at her. "Flour, coffee, and about a pound of salt pork, if you have it," he said. "And if you could tell me whether Ridgeback has a telegraph office, I would appreciate it." "Telegraph's at the stage depot 2 streets over," she said, already moving to gather his order. "You in town long?" "That depends," he said. She looked up from the flour barrel. "On what?" He seemed to consider the question with more seriousness than it warranted. "On how the land negotiations go." Pauline's hands did not stop moving, but something inside her went very carefully still. Land negotiations in Ridgeback meant one thing, and that thing was Silas Drum. She had learned to be cautious around the topic the way a person learns to be cautious around a fire, not from one dramatic burning, but from a long accumulation of small scorches. "You should know," she said, wrapping the salt pork in brown paper, "that most land negotiations in this county end with one party considerably worse off than they started." He tilted his head slightly. "Which party? The one that isn't Silas Drum." He said nothing for a moment, and she could feel him thinking, not the frantic, anxious thinking of a man who has received a warning and does not know what to do with it, but the deep, deliberate thinking of a man who is placing new information into an existing structure. "I appreciate the warning," he said finally. "Frederick Covington." He extended his hand across the counter. She looked at it for half a second before she took it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely correct, not the crushing handshake of a man trying to establish dominance, not the limp touch of a man who was uncertain, just a clean, honest handshake. "Pauline Whitaker," she said, "this is my store." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile, but the promise of one. "I gathered," he said. "Whitaker's General Store." He had read the sign. She almost liked him for that. Almost. He paid for his goods, touched the brim of his hat, and left. She watched him through the window as he untied the gray mare and led her toward the stage depot, and she told herself that whatever his business was in Ridgeback, it was not her concern. She told herself that quite firmly. She did not believe it even slightly. He came back 2 days later for lamp oil, and then 3 days after that for a new length of rope and a box of matches. He had taken a room at the boarding house run by widow Margaret Chen, a Chinese-American woman of extraordinary competence and absolutely no nonsense, and he appeared to be conducting his land negotiations in the methodical, patient way that he did everything else. It was on his 4th visit to the store, a gray Thursday morning with the smell of coming rain on the wind, that things changed. The store was empty except for the 2 of them. Pauline was inventorying a new shipment of canned goods, marking numbers in the ledger with the focused attention she gave everything, when Frederick came in and set a copy of the Ridgeback Courier on her counter. "You've read this?" he asked. She glanced at it without setting down her pencil. It was the week's paper, and she had indeed read it, as she read everything that passed through the store. Information was the only currency in Ridgeback that Silas Drum had not yet found a way to counterfeit. "I have," she said. "The article about the irrigation survey, about the water rights along the basin's eastern edge." She set down her pencil. "What about it?" He was leaning against the counter now, not in the casual way of a man making himself comfortable, but in the way of a man who has decided a conversation deserves his full attention. "It mentions a land claim that was filed by your father, James Whitaker, filed in 1874. The article says the claim is currently in dispute." The rain smell was getting stronger through the window, and somewhere outside a horse was shifting and stamping. Pauline looked at Frederick Covington for a long, careful moment. "My father has been dead for 8 months, she said. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." The sincerity of it was so uncomplicated that it almost caught her off guard. People in Ridgeback offered condolences about her father the way they offered them about bad weather. It was acknowledged. It was briefly lamented. And then everyone moved on because there was nothing to be done. Frederick said it like he meant it, like he had actually considered what it meant, and that was different. The claim is in dispute because Silas Drum wants the water rights, she said. He has wanted them since before my father filed them. He will do whatever is necessary to get them. Have you engaged a lawyer? She almost laughed. The county attorney is Silas Drum's cousin. The nearest federal land office is in Carson City. I have no money to hire someone to ride to Carson City and spend weeks arguing my case against a man who can afford to wait me out indefinitely. She picked up her pencil again. So yes, I've read the article. Frederick was quiet for a moment. I'm a land agent, he said. I work for the Western Lands Commission. We were chartered by the federal government 2 years ago to investigate improper land claim disputes in Nevada and Utah territory. Pauline put the pencil down again. She looked at him with new eyes, not suspicious exactly, but the careful, assessing look of a woman who has had the experience of help arriving that turned out, on closer inspection, to be a different kind of trap. And what does that mean for my father's claim? She asked. It means, he said, that I'm here because of your father's claim specifically. It's one of 11 claims the commission is reviewing in this county, but I'll need documentation. Everything your father filed, any correspondence, the original survey maps if you have them. And if I provide all of that, she said slowly, the commission will do what exactly? Investigate whether the dispute against the claim is legitimate, and if it isn't, he paused, the claim reverts to its rightful owner. To me, she said. To you, he confirmed. The rain began then, a sudden Nevada downpour that hit the roof like a thrown handful of gravel and drummed against the window in heavy sheets. The interior of the store went dim and close, and the smell of dust becoming wet earth drifted through the gaps in the wood. Pauline looked at this man who had appeared in her store 8 days ago asking for flour and coffee, and she tried to calculate the probability that he was exactly what he said he was, and the probability that he was something else entirely. I'll need to see your commission papers, she said. Of course. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, heavy federal paper, the kind that was expensive to print with a proper seal and signature. She examined it carefully. It looked real. But looking real and being real were not always the same thing, and she had learned that lesson at some cost. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded as though this were entirely reasonable, and then he did something that Pauline had not expected. He turned to go and then paused at the door and turned back and said, Miss Whitaker, may I ask you something that isn't about land claims? She blinked. Go ahead. Have you lived in Ridgeback your whole life? It was such a peculiar question, so completely stripped of any agenda she could identify, that for a moment she simply stood there with the rain hammering overhead. Yes, she said. My whole life. He looked at her for a moment with that searching expression she was beginning to recognize. What does that feel like? He said. Nobody had ever asked her that before. Not once in 31 years of living in this flat, wind-scoured place. I don't know, she said, too surprised to be guarded. I've never thought about it that way. Most people haven't, he said, not unkindly. And then he pushed through the door into the rain and was gone. Pauline stood in her dim store with the sound of rain filling every silence, and she felt something shift inside her, something that had been locked in one position for so long that the movement of it was almost painful. Like a joint that has been kept still too long and suddenly being asked to bend. She thought about the question all that afternoon. What did it feel like to have lived her whole life in one place? She had never let herself examine it because examining it too closely would have required her to acknowledge the longing that lived beneath it, the longing for something else, something beyond the horizon, something she had no practical way of reaching. Her mother had died when she was 9. Her father had needed her to run the store. There had been no money for travel, no opportunity for escape, no moment when the world had widened enough to let her out. She had loved her father. She had loved the store. And she had loved Ridgeback in the way that a person loves the only world they have ever known, which is a complicated kind of love, full of both tenderness and resentment. Nobody had ever thought to ask her about it before, because nobody in Ridgeback thought of Pauline Whitaker as a person who had an interior life that warranted exploration. She was the storekeeper. She was competent and reliable and slightly formidable. She was the woman who kept James Whitaker's ledgers in perfect order and knew exactly how much axle grease she had in stock at any given moment. She was not, as far as Ridgeback was concerned, a woman with feelings about having lived her whole life in one place. Frederick Covington, apparently, thought differently. He came back the next morning with the rain gone and the sky washed clean and pale, and he brought with him 2 cups of coffee from the boarding house kitchen and set one on her counter without asking if she wanted it. It was a presumptuous thing to do and it shouldn't have worked, but there was something in the gesture, the simple assumption that she might want a good cup of coffee, that bypassed her defenses entirely. She wrapped her hands around the cup and drank it and said nothing about the presumption. "I thought of another question," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "What do you read?" he asked. "When you have time, what do you choose to read?" Nobody had ever asked her that before either. She found herself telling him about the stack of books she kept behind the counter, a battered copy of Jane Eyre that she had read so many times the spine was held together with a piece of ribbon, a collection of scientific essays about geology that she had ordered from a catalog, and that made the earth beneath her feet feel more interesting, a history of the Roman Empire that she read in the evenings when the store was closed and the desert went quiet. She told him that she read everything that came through the store: newspapers, pamphlets, the labels on canned goods when nothing else was available, because information was the thing she was most hungry for, more than companionship, more than comfort, more than anything she could name. He listened to all of it without interrupting or looking at her the way people looked when they were waiting politely for you to finish. He listened like it mattered. "And what does the geology tell you?" he asked, when she had finished. "That everything underneath us has been moving and shifting for millions of years," she said. "That what looks permanent is just moving slowly." He looked at her with that expression she was starting to look for without meaning to, that combination of interest and recognition, as though she had said something that confirmed a thing he had suspected. "That's a remarkable way to think about land rights," he said. "I wasn't thinking about land rights," she said. "No," he agreed. "I didn't think you were." She gave him access to her father's papers that afternoon. It took 2 weeks for Frederick to work through the documentation. He came to the store every morning, and Pauline cleared space at the back table where she usually did the bookkeeping, and he spread out maps and filed correspondence and survey records, and she brought him coffee and occasionally leaned over his shoulder to point at something he had misread or misunderstood. He smelled like wood smoke and cedar and the outdoors, which was not a romantic observation but simply a true one, and she permitted herself to make it because she was, at 31, too old and too honest to pretend she didn't notice things. He asked her questions constantly. Not about the land claim, those were contained and purposeful. The other questions, the ones that arrived between the official ones, were something different entirely. What did she think about the railroad coming to Nevada? What had she wanted to be when she was young, before she understood that the store was what she was going to be? Did she ever talk to her father about things other than the business? Was there something she had never told anyone that she thought about often? Each question landed on her like a small, precise stone dropped into still water, disturbing the surface, creating ripples that spread outward and would not stop. "Nobody has ever asked me that before," she said, more than once. And every time, she watched him file the answer away with the same careful attention he gave everything, as though her inner life were as worthy of documentation as a federal land survey. She began to understand, slowly and with some resistance, that Frederick Covington was a man who had developed the habit of genuine curiosity about people. Not the performative curiosity of someone trying to be charming, but the deep, structural curiosity of someone for whom other people's inner worlds were the most interesting thing on earth. She found it terrifying. She found it wonderful. She was not accustomed to being known. She was accustomed to being useful, to being competent, to being present, But known was different. Known required exposure, and exposure required trust, and trust was the one resource that Ridgeback, under the shadow of Silas Drum, had taught her to hoard with absolute ferocity. Silas Drum himself appeared in the store on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of Frederick's stay in Ridgeback, when the desert had turned cold enough that the morning brought frost on the windows, and everyone wore their coats all day. Silas was a large man, not fat but dense, built like old timber, with a face that might have been handsome 20 years ago, and now had the closed, stubborn quality of a man who had gotten his way enough times to stop being able to imagine not getting it. He came in with 2 of his hired men behind him, which was not subtle, and he looked around the store with the proprietary ease of a man who believed that everything he looked at belonged to him eventually. "Pauline," he said, "not Miss Whitaker." Just Pauline, because he had never in the 20 years she had known him offered her the courtesy of a title. "Silas," she replied, equally without title because she had years ago decided that if he was not going to be courteous she was not going to pretend he was. He noticed Frederick at the back table immediately. Frederick did not look up from his papers. "Who's this?" Silas said. "Customer," Pauline said. Silas looked at the table covered in survey maps and correspondence and clearly did not believe her. "What kind of customer?" "The paying kind," she said. "Was there something you needed, Silas?" "I have a shipment to inventory." He looked at Frederick again, and something moved through his expression: calculation, suspicion, the rapid, cold assessment of a man who has kept his position by anticipating threats. "I heard there was a federal agent in town," he said. "Is that so?" Pauline said, not making it a question. "Heard he was asking questions about land claims." Silas picked up a jar from the nearest shelf and turned it in his thick hands, not looking at it, just handling it the way a man handles something when he is trying to appear casual and is not quite succeeding. "Now, Pauline, you and I both know that your father's claim on the Eastern Basin water rights has always been on shaky ground. James was a fine man, but he wasn't much of a surveyor, and the documentation he filed in '74 had some problems." "Did it?" she said. "It did." He set down the jar. "I've been patient about it out of respect for your father's memory, but there are investors interested in that land now, and I have an obligation to them. I think the cleanest solution is for you to sell the claim to me. I'll give you a fair price. We can settle it friendly." The word friendly sat in the air between them with a particular kind of weight, the weight of a word being used to mean its opposite. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then at Frederick, and then back at her. "Don't take too long thinking about it," he said. "Friendly doesn't last forever." He left, and his men went with him, and the store felt like it expanded slightly on their departure, as though it had been holding its breath. Frederick looked up from his papers. "How long has he been doing that?" he said. "Since before my father died," she said. "He started making offers about 6 months before my father got sick. My father always refused. After my father died, the offers started coming to me." "And you've refused? Every time?" He was looking at her with that searching expression. "Why," he said, "given the practical pressures, you're managing this alone. The legal situation is uncertain." "Because it was my father's land," she said. "Because my father spent years fighting to secure those water rights so that this basin didn't become entirely dependent on what Silas Drum decided to allow. Because if I sell to Silas, 3 or 4 smaller farms along the Eastern Basin lose their water access within the season." She stopped. "Because it's the right thing to do, and I have not yet become so exhausted that I've stopped caring about that." The last sentence came out more raw than she intended, more honest than she usually permitted herself to be. Frederick set down his pen. "I believe you," he said, "for whatever that's worth." She looked at him. "Right now," she said carefully, "it's worth quite a bit." That was the moment, she would later understand, when she began to fall in love with Frederick Covington. Not a dramatic moment, not a kiss or a grand gesture, just a simple exchange of truth in a cold Nevada store with frost on the windows and the ghost of Silas Drum's threat still hanging in the air. The moment when she understood that this man's belief in her was not contingent on proof, and his curiosity was not a performance, and his presence in her life, however long it lasted, was something real. She did not let herself dwell on it. There was too much at stake, and she was too practical for dwelling. The following week, Frederick had enough of the documentation organized to send a preliminary report to the commission in Carson City. He rode to the telegraph office himself and sent it, and when he came back, he told her that a formal investigator would be dispatched within 2 weeks to review his findings and make an official determination. 2 weeks, she said. Give or take, he said, depending on road conditions. She nodded. 2 weeks. She could manage 2 weeks. She had managed 8 months alone, and before that years of her father's declining health, when she had essentially been running everything by herself anyway. She was good at managing time and bad weather and difficult circumstances. What she was less good at, she was beginning to understand, was managing the feeling that had taken up residence somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum, a warm, alert, slightly alarmed feeling that woke up every morning when she heard the bell above the store door and saw Frederick Covington walk in. She asked him questions too, now that the dynamic had shifted into something more mutual. She asked him where he was from Philadelphia originally, then a decade spent moving west, taking whatever work needed doing and eventually landing at the commission. She asked him whether he had family, a younger sister in Pennsylvania, parents deceased. She asked him whether the work satisfied him genuinely, not politely, and he was quiet for a moment before answering. It did at first, he said. There's something right about trying to correct injustice, about making sure that people who followed the rules don't lose out to people who didn't. He paused. But after a few years it starts to feel like pouring water into a bucket with holes in it. You fix one claim, and 3 others get corrupted while you're looking the other way. The forces on the other side have more money and more patience than the commission ever will. Then why keep doing it? She said. He looked at her. Because of people like your father, he said. Because somebody has to. She thought about that for the rest of the day. The particular kind of goodness that keeps going, not because it is rewarded but because it is the right thing to do. She had lived her whole life by exactly that logic, and it had never occurred to her that someone else was out there doing the same in a different territory for different people, under the same principle. It struck her as the loneliest and most necessary thing in the world. On a Saturday evening, 10 days into his stay, Frederick invited her to have supper with him at the boarding house. Margaret Chen's kitchen was an extraordinary thing. She had developed a cooking style that drew from both the traditional Chinese dishes of her upbringing and the provisions available in a Nevada desert town, and the result was something that could not be categorized but was universally recognized as excellent. Pauline accepted, because she was tired of eating alone, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that she wanted more of Frederick Covington's company than the store's business hours provided. They sat across from each other at the long boarding house table, and Margaret served them without comment, but with a look that Pauline recognized as the look of a woman who has observed a situation clearly and reached a conclusion she is keeping to herself for now. They talked through supper and into the evening, long past when the meal was finished and the other boarders had drifted off to their rooms. They talked about books. He had read Jane Eyre, which surprised her, and they argued amicably about Rochester's culpability for the better part of an hour. They talked about the geology of the Spring Mountains, and he confessed that he had bought one of the same essay collections she had and found it equally compelling. They talked about what they believed about justice and what they believed about faith and what they believed about the capacity of human beings to be simultaneously terrible and extraordinary. He asked her whether she was afraid. Of what? She said. Of everything that's at stake here, he said. Of Drum. Of what happens if the commission's determination doesn't go the way we hope. She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. Yes, she said. I'm afraid most of the time. I just don't permit it to make decisions for me. How did you learn that? He said. Nobody has ever asked me that before, she said. He smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him. Not the near smile, not the promise of one, but the real thing which transformed his face in a way that she had not anticipated, and that required her to look away for a moment to collect herself. "My father taught me," she said when she had. "Not by telling me, he was not a man who explained things. By showing me. Every time Silas pushed, my father just went back to work, like the pushing was weather, something to be noted and endured and then forgotten in favor of what needed doing." She paused. "I used to think that was a kind of cowardice, just ignoring the threat. I understand now that it was the opposite. Because acknowledging the fear gives it power," Frederick said. "Because the work is the answer to the fear," she said. "If you keep doing the work, the fear has less room to grow." He was looking at her in a way that she felt throughout her entire body, which was a new and somewhat alarming experience. "You're the most remarkable person I've encountered in a very long time," he said. And he said it simply and without any apparent expectation that the statement required anything from her in return. She could not immediately remember how to speak. "That is either a very kind thing to say," she managed eventually, "or a commentary on the quality of the people you encounter in your line of work." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good laugh, warm and genuine, without reservation. "Both," he said. "Definitely both." The evening ended at the door of the boarding house, in the cold, clear desert night with a sky full of stars so dense they looked like something spilled rather than something arranged. Pauline stood on the step and Frederick stood slightly below, and the air between them was charged in a way that required no analysis. "Thank you for the evening," she said. "Thank you for trusting me," he said, "with the papers and with everything else." She looked at him for a moment, at the honest angles of his face in the starlight, at the careful, open expression he wore when he was being entirely himself. "Nobody has ever worked that hard to earn it," she said. "The trust." "They should have," he said quietly. She went inside before she did something inadvisable, and she lay awake in the cold of her room above the store for a long time, listening to the desert wind and feeling the warm, alarmed thing in her chest beat steadily against the dark. The next 4 days were both the best and the worst of Pauline's recent life, which was saying something because the previous 8 months had not been characterized by any great abundance of good days. The best of it was Frederick, the morning coffee and the questions, and the accumulating warmth of a person being consistently, reliably interested in who she was. She told him things she had never told anyone. She told him about the night her mother died, and how her father had held her hand for 3 hours without speaking, because he did not have any words that were adequate and he knew it. She told him about the time she was 17, and a traveling bookseller had come through Ridgeback, and she had spent every saved penny she had on 4 books, and had not regretted a single cent. She told him about the fear, not the general ambient fear of Silas Drum, but the specific, deep fear that she was going to spend her whole life in this store and die there, and nobody would be very much changed by either the living or the dying. "Nobody has ever asked me about the fear," she said. "People in Ridgeback aren't much for asking about inner states." "What do they ask about?" he said. "The weather, the price of flour, whether the next supply wagon will be on time." She paused. "I don't say that unkindly. People here have hard lives and there isn't much room left over after the practical concerns." "But you make room," he said. "I make room," she agreed. "In here." She pressed 2 fingers briefly to her sternum where the warm, alarmed thing lived. "There's an entire world in here that has never had anyone to talk to." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and it was not the gesture of a man making an advance. It was the gesture of a man saying, "I hear you," and Pauline, who was not a woman who cried, felt tears arrive with absolutely no warning whatsoever and had to spend a moment looking at the survey map in front of her and breathing very carefully. "I'm sorry," she said when she had recovered herself. "That was excessive." "It wasn't," he said firmly. The worst of those 4 days was the escalating pressure from Silas Drum. His hired men started appearing near the store with no business being there, just loitering, watching. Someone threw a rock through the store window in the middle of the night, and when she swept up the glass in the morning, she found a note attached. Consider the offer. The county sheriff, a soft-bodied man named Harlan Webb who had been in Silas Drum's pocket for years, came by to take a report that she knew perfectly well he would file and forget. Frederick saw the broken window when he arrived for his morning coffee, and his jaw tightened in a way she had not seen before, a controlled anger, the anger of a man who knows that visible reaction is what the perpetrator wants and is denying them the satisfaction of it. "This needs to go in my report," he said. "It will just make him angrier," she said. "Good," he said, which surprised her. "Let him be angry. Anger makes people reckless." She looked at him. "Is that a strategy?" "It's an observation," he said, "though in this case it may amount to the same thing." He sent another telegram to Carson City that afternoon, documenting the intimidation and requesting expedited review. The response came back the next morning. The commissioner himself was dispatching an investigator with full authority to issue injunctions. Expected arrival, 10 days. 10 days. It felt like a long time. It also felt impossibly short. She thought about what the investigator's arrival would mean. If the commission determined in her favor, she would have federal protection for the water rights. Silas Drum's claim would be invalidated. The farmers along the eastern basin would keep their water access. She would win not a final, complete victory, because men like Silas rarely accepted final defeats, but enough of one to matter. And Frederick would leave. The thought arrived without warning and sat down heavily inside her, and she looked at it with the same careful honesty she tried to apply to everything. He had never said he was staying. He had a job that required him to travel. He had other claims in other counties, other disputes, other people who needed what he did. He had been in Ridgeback for less than 3 weeks. It was absolutely irrational to feel this way about a man she had known for 3 weeks. She had been telling herself this for approximately a week, and it had not helped. Frederick came into the store on the evening of the 12th day of his stay, when the light was going copper and rose over the western mountains, and the store was empty of everyone except Pauline, who was balancing the weekly accounts. He came in and he did not go to the back table. He stood in front of her counter and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, an expression that had come unguarded, that had not yet been organized into the careful, composed exterior he usually maintained. "I need to tell you something," he said. She put down her pen. "All right. When I sent those first reports to Carson City," he said, "I was professionally invested in this case. The documentation, the survey records, the pattern of illegal intimidation, it was a strong case and I wanted to win it." He paused. "I am still professionally invested. I'm also now personally invested in a way that is probably irregular for someone in my position, and I think you should know that." She looked at him steadily. "And what does personally invested mean?" He met her eyes. "It means that if the commission's determination goes the wrong way, which I do not believe it will, but if it did, I would not simply close the file and ride to the next county. It means that what happens to you matters to me separately from what happens to the case." Another pause. "It means that I have been asking you questions because I am genuinely, completely captivated by who you are, and I don't know what to do with that except be honest about it." The silence in the store was very deep. Outside, a horse went past at a slow walk and someone somewhere was calling a name across a distance, and the copper light was fading fast into purple. "I don't know what to do with that either," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I just could not say it." She looked at him for a long moment. At the careful, honest face of this man who had ridden into her store on a gray mare and asked her what it felt like to have lived her whole life in one place, and who had spent 3 weeks asking her everything she had never been asked and listening to every answer as though it were essential information, and who stood now in the fading light of her store telling her the truth because he did not know how to do otherwise. "Frederick," she said. "Yes. Ask me something else." He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "What do you want? Not for the land claim, not for the store. What do you want for yourself? Nobody had ever asked her that before. She felt the answer arrive from somewhere very deep, from the place where the world she had kept inside her all this time lived. I want to stop being alone, she said. I want someone who doesn't stop asking when things get complicated. She stopped, and then made herself continue, I want whatever this is to be something real. He came around the counter. Not quickly, not with any dramatic urgency, but with the deliberate care he applied to everything. He stood close to her, close enough that she could see the gray-green of his eyes clearly in the last of the light, and he said, "It is something real. It has been real since the second morning when I brought you coffee and you didn't tell me to take it back." "I almost did," she said. "I know," he said. "I could tell. I was very glad you didn't." She reached up and touched his face because she was 31 years old and she was tired of being careful, and the world in her chest had been waiting long enough. He turned his face into her hand like something that recognized a warmth it had been searching for, and then he kissed her gently, carefully, with the same quality of full attention he gave everything, and she felt the locked thing in her chest finally open. The next 3 days were different. Not in any way that was obvious from the outside. Frederick still came to the store in the mornings, still worked at the back table, still sent reports to Carson City. But there was something between them now that did not require management, that simply existed, warm and present, like a lamp that had been lit. Margaret Chen observed it at supper with an expression of profound satisfaction that she did not bother to conceal, and said nothing about it, which was the most eloquent possible response. On the evening of the 14th day, when the investigator from Carson City was expected the following morning, everything came apart. Pauline was closing up the store when Silas Drum walked in, and this time he had not brought 2 hired men, he had brought 4, and one of them closed the door behind them with a finality that Pauline felt in her bones. "We're past friendly," Silas said. She kept her face still. "So I gathered. The commission investigator is coming tomorrow," he said. "I know. I have a man at the telegraph office." He moved to stand in front of her counter and his bulk blocked the light from the window. "Now, I'm going to be straightforward with you, because I think you'd appreciate that more than games. If that investigator sees your documentation, my claim gets invalidated. I spent 8 years positioning this, Pauline. I'm not going to let one woman and one federal pencil pusher take it from me. And the deed," she said, keeping her voice level. "Is that what this is about now?" He smiled, and it was not a pleasant thing. "Your father filed a supplemental deed in 1877, a document that affirms the original water rights claim and adds a land boundary description that would make it bulletproof against any challenge. Your father told me he destroyed it. But I don't believe that. I think it exists, and I think you have it. The 1877 deed." Her father had told her about it in the last weeks of his life, with the fever burning through him and the words coming slowly. He had told her that the deed was hidden, and that she was never to tell Silas Drum its location. He had not told her what to do if Silas Drum came to collect it at gunpoint. She heard the boarding house door down the street, and then Frederick's voice calling good night to someone, and her whole body went taut. "Silas," she said quickly, "this is not something you can walk back from. Tell me where the deed is," he said. And then the door opened and Frederick walked in, because he had seen the lights and the closed door and the blocked-in look of the store's windows, and he came to the wrong conclusion and entered. One of Silas's men put a gun to his head before the door had fully swung shut. That was the moment Pauline had already told you about. Frederick with the revolver at his temple, looking at her with absolute calm. Silas demanding the deed. Pauline calculating and deciding and choosing the truth. "The deed doesn't exist," she said quietly. "It never did. My father destroyed it the night before he died because he knew what Silas would do if he ever got his hands on it." And in the silence that followed, Frederick moved. He had, Pauline would learn later, spent 3 years before the commission working for a federal marshal in Colorado, which was a fact he had not mentioned because it had not come up, which was the kind of thing that made you simultaneously admire and want to throttle a man who answered every question you asked, but sometimes required you to ask the right ones. He caught the gunman's wrist with both hands, rotated with a precise, practiced movement that redirected the weapon away from his head, and in the chaos that followed, 3 seconds of absolute confusion and noise. Silas Drum made the additional mistake of reaching for the gun on his own hip instead of running, which gave Frederick the extra half-second he needed. When it was over, Silas Drum was against the wall with Frederick's forearm across his collarbone, and the confiscated revolver aimed with professional steadiness at a point that required no interpretation. The 4 hired men stood motionless, having had the specific experience of watching their employer restrained and correctly calculated that the night's odds were no longer favorable. "You are going to sit down," Frederick said to Silas, in a voice that was very quiet and very final. "You are going to remain seated until the sheriff arrives. And then you are going to discover what it looks like when the federal government takes an active interest in 8 years of fraudulent land claims, witness intimidation, and conspiracy." He glanced at Pauline. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. Her hands were shaking, which she noted with distant irritation. "Good." He kept his eyes on Silas. "Go to the sheriff's office and bring Harlan Webb here. If he refuses to come, tell him I have the authority to telegraph the federal marshal in Carson City tonight and that I intend to do so regardless." "Harlan Webb is in Drum's pocket," she said. "I know," Frederick said. "Bring him anyway. The pockets are about to be emptied." She went. And when she came back with a very pale and reluctant Sheriff Harlan Webb, she brought with her also Margaret Chen, who had been told what was happening and had appeared with a Winchester rifle from behind her front door, and a look on her face that made even Silas Drum's hired men step back. The night was long and complicated. Silas and his men were taken into custody. The town jail was not large enough for all of them, which created a logistical problem that was eventually solved by locking the 4 hired men in the livery stable under guard, and keeping Silas in the cell with Harlan Webb sitting outside it, looking like a man who was reconsidering every professional choice he had ever made. Frederick sat at the sheriff's desk and wrote for 3 hours by lamplight formal affidavits, incident reports, a long and detailed communication to the commission, and to the federal marshal's office in Carson City. Pauline sat across from him and answered every question he asked, and Margaret Chen sat in the corner with her rifle across her knees and the particular composed expression of someone who has handled worse. At 2 in the morning the work was done. Margaret went home. Pauline and Frederick walked out into the cold desert night, and Pauline felt the shaking in her hands finally stop. "The 1877 deed," Frederick said after a moment. She looked at him. "Does it exist?" She was quiet for 3 steps. "Yes," she said. He was quiet too for a moment, not surprised, just absorbing it. "Where is it?" "Hidden in the false back of the strongbox under the store counter," she said. "Father built it when I was 12. He showed me how to open it when he got sick. He told me to use it when the time was right and not before. Why didn't you give it to me with the rest of the documentation?" It was a fair question and it deserved a fair answer. "Because I didn't trust you yet," she said. "When you arrived, I didn't know whether you were what you said you were or whether you were another approach from Silas, someone pretending to help as a way of finding out what I had." She paused. "I've been operating under the assumption that help is usually a trap. That's what living in Ridgeback under Silas Drum for 31 years teaches you." "And now," he said. "Now I trust you," she said. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him, and in the cold, clear air with the stars overhead and the dark bulk of the mountains against the sky, he turned to look at her. "I am going to need that deed for the morning meeting with the commission investigator," he said, "and I want you to know that I understand why you held it back, and I would have done the same." "Would you?" she said. "When the only thing standing between you and losing everything is a piece of paper," he said, "you hold the paper until you're certain." She looked at him for a long moment. At the honest, steady face of a man who had spent a month asking her everything and had not flinched at a single answer, who had stood in her store with a gun at his temple and been calm, who sat in a sheriff's office for 3 hours writing reports at 2 in the morning because that was what was needed and he did not know any other way to be. "Frederick," she said. "Yes." "What do you want?" She asked it back to him, his own question returned. "Not for the case, for yourself." He looked at the stars for a moment and then he looked at her. "I want to stop moving," he said. "I have been moving for 10 years and I think I have been using the work as a reason not to examine the fact that I am very tired of being alone." He paused. "I want what I found in Ridgeback, which is not something I expected to find in Ridgeback." "What did you find in Ridgeback?" she said softly. He reached out and tucked a strand of wind-blown hair behind her ear with a gentleness so exact it ached. "You," he said. "I found a person who makes me want to ask every question I've never asked and stay for every answer." She reached up and took his hand where it rested against her face and held it there. "Then stay," she said. He leaned his forehead against hers in the cold desert dark, under the extravagant sky. "I intend to," he said. The commission investigator arrived the next morning on the southbound stage, a serious, spare man named Aldrich who wore a federal seal on his coat and appeared to be entirely unmoved by the drama of the previous evening, which impressed Pauline considerably. She produced the 1877 deed from the strongbox, and it was everything her father had said. It was comprehensive, properly witnessed, legally sound, the final piece that made the water rights claim unassailable. Aldrich reviewed the documentation for 4 hours, asked questions of both Pauline and Frederick in a precise and methodical way, and at the end of the afternoon issued a formal determination. James Whitaker's claim was valid. The deed of 1877 was hereby entered into the federal land record, and any competing claim by Silas Drum or any associated party was declared null. Silas Drum, facing charges of witness intimidation, conspiracy to defraud, and illegal discharge of a firearm in addition to the fraudulent land claim, was transported to Carson City by the federal marshal who arrived 2 days later. Harlan Webb resigned as county sheriff before he could be formally investigated, which accomplished the same result with less paperwork. Ridgeback was not, overnight, a different place. That was not how things worked, but it was quieter. The hired men without their employer dispersed. The farmers along the eastern basin received word of the determination, and several of them came to the store to thank Pauline in the careful, understated way of people who have been holding their breath for a long time and are not yet ready to fully exhale. Margaret Chen made a celebratory dinner that lasted until midnight and involved more food than Pauline had seen assembled in one place since her father's annual 4th of July gathering, and the boarders and a rotating cast of neighbors came and went, and the store's back table was cleared of federal documents and covered instead with plates. Frederick sat beside Pauline at the long table, and she felt him present and solid and warm at her side, and she thought about the question she had asked herself on the first day he arrived. What was the probability that he was exactly what he said he was? 100%, she now understood. Exactly 100%. The weeks that followed were the strangest and best of Pauline's adult life, which was becoming a phrase she used frequently because each successive week managed to be better than the last. Frederick remained in Ridgeback while he completed the paperwork for the case. There was a great deal of it, as federal proceedings tended to generate, and then he sent a communication to the commission explaining that he was requesting a temporary posting change and asking whether there was work in Nevada that would allow him to remain in the area. There was, as it turned out. The commission had 3 other cases in the southern Nevada counties that needed attention, and the fact that Frederick had just successfully resolved the most complicated case in the territory's recent memory gave him considerable standing to request what he wanted. He told her about the posting change on a Sunday afternoon, sitting across from her in the store after closing time, with the autumn light going gold through the west window. "You're staying," she said. For the foreseeable future, he said. Which I am informed could be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on how complicated the other cases turn out to be. And after that, he looked at her steadily. Pauline, I'm hoping that by the time after that arrives, the question of where I am will not be a question at all. She looked back at him. Because I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd morning, he said, when you told me about the geology essays and what they made you feel about permanence, and I realized that you had been having the most interesting conversation in Ridgeback entirely in your own head for 31 years, and all you needed was someone to talk to. She felt the warm, alarmed thing in her chest settle into something steadier and deeper, something that was not alarmed anymore at all. All I needed, she repeated softly. Not all, he amended. That was an oversimplification. You are the most self-sufficient person I have ever encountered. What I mean is that you deserved someone to talk to. You deserve a great deal more than this place has given you. She reached across the table and took both his hands in hers. This place, she said, has given me the store and the land and 26 years of my father, and the best education I could have gotten anywhere because I read everything that came through here, and now it has given me you. She looked at him. I think Ridgeback has done all right by me in the end. He turned his hands to hold hers, and they sat in the gold Sunday light, and neither of them needed to say anything for a while, because some things are complete without words, and this was one of them. November came, bringing the kind of cold that the desert did differently than anywhere else, sharp and clear and absolute, with nights that went down hard below freezing and days that were brilliant with thin winter sun. The store was busy with pre-winter supply purchases, and Pauline hired a young woman named Clara Reeve, recently arrived from a failed homestead to the east, to help with the counter work. Clara was quick and quiet and grateful, and having another person in the store during the busy hours gave Pauline space to breathe. It also, incidentally, gave her and Frederick space to have lunch together without feeling that the store was suffering for it. They established a routine that felt, to Pauline, like something she had not believed she was allowed to have, a texture to the days that was warm and consistent and held against the cold and the uncertainty. He would come to the store in the morning, and they would have coffee together while she went over the day's work. He would go to his own work, visiting farms and properties and telegraph offices and the county land records, and return in the afternoon. Most evenings they had supper with Margaret, who had appointed herself their unofficial guardian with such transparent delight that it was impossible to object. On evenings when Frederick had late reports to write, Pauline would sit at the boarding-house table across from him with a book, and the companionable quiet of 2 people working in the same space was a thing she had not known she was hungry for until it was provided, whereupon she found she could not imagine its absence. He continued to ask her questions. Not in the searching, getting-to-know-you way of the early weeks, but in the way of someone who has committed to understanding another person completely and treats the project as ongoing and without end date. He asked her what she thought about things he had read, and what she remembered about things she had experienced, and what she wanted for the store and for herself, and for the future. He asked her what she feared now that the immediate danger was resolved, which was a good question, because the immediate danger had taken up so much space that its absence left room for other fears to surface. She told him she was afraid that the store would never be more than a surviving thing, that she would keep it going but never expand it, never make it into the thing she had always thought it could be, a proper lending library in the back room, a mail-order book service for the people in the territory who never came to town, a place that was genuinely useful beyond the provision of dry goods. She told him this was probably not a practical aspiration. He told her it was an entirely practical aspiration and asked her why she hadn't begun yet. She looked at him. Because there was no money and no time, and it seemed what? Excessive, she said. Too much to want. He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to understand meant that he was restraining himself from saying something with some force. "Pauline," he said carefully, "there is no such thing as too much to want. There is only wanting things that are harmful and wanting things that are not. A lending library is not harmful. The practical considerations are solvable," he said. "Let me look at the financials with you and we'll find a way." They found a way. It took 3 weeks of evenings at the back table, working through numbers and suppliers and the logistics of setting up a book acquisition arrangement with a printer in Sacramento who was willing to establish a standing order. But by the end of November, the back room of Whitaker's general store had a lending library, not large, 43 books to start, arranged on 3 new shelves that Frederick had built himself on a Saturday while Pauline told him he was not required to do that, and he told her he enjoyed building things, and would she please stop arguing and hand him the level. The library opened on the 1st of December. 6 people checked out books on the first day, which was 6 more than Pauline had expected, and she stood in the back room with the small, new shelves and the cold winter light coming through the window, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt that her life was expanding. December moved through its weeks with a quality that Pauline kept trying to find the right word for and settling eventually on grace, a word she did not use often and meant precisely. The land claim was formally recorded. The lending library grew to 67 books by Christmas because several of the farmers' wives began requesting specific titles and she ordered them. Clara Reeve proved excellent with the counter customers and developed a quiet friendship with Pauline that was both unexpected and welcome. Margaret Chen organized a Christmas gathering that was the largest social event Ridgeback had seen in years, which said something about how different the town felt without Silas Drum's shadow hanging over it. Frederick gave Pauline, for Christmas, a first edition of a geological survey of the Great Basin, a proper scientific text, expensive and rare, with detailed maps and essays that she had never seen before. She held it in both hands and looked at it and then looked at him and could not for a moment speak. "I had it shipped from a bookseller in San Francisco," he said. "I hope it's perfect," she said. "It is completely and absolutely perfect." She gave him a bound journal that she had special ordered, with a note inside that read, "For the questions you haven't asked yet," which made him very still for a moment. And then he pulled her close and held her in the middle of her back room with the lending library shelves around them and the Christmas cold against the windows. And they stayed like that for a long time. January came, raw and brilliant, and Frederick's other commission cases called him away for 2 weeks to a remote property dispute in Nye County. He left on a Monday morning with his gray mare and his saddlebags and his commission papers, and Pauline stood on the store's porch in the freezing January air and watched him go, and felt the absence of him begin immediately. She had not expected the degree of it. She was a self-sufficient person. She had been alone for years and had managed it adequately. But 2 weeks without Frederick turned out to be 2 weeks of noticing all the places where his presence had become woven into the fabric of her days. The empty chair at the back table, the morning coffee that was only 1 cup, the evenings that were quiet in a way that felt like lack rather than peace. She threw herself into work, which was what she did. She expanded the library to 90 books. She started a mail-order book service, writing a notice that she posted at the stage depot and the telegraph office, and received her first outside order within 5 days, a schoolteacher 40 miles east asking for 3 specific titles. She hired Clara full-time and raised her wages, which was both the right thing to do and made practical sense since the store's business had improved markedly since the autumn. She wrote long letters to Frederick about all of it, and his letters back were detailed and warm and full of questions. What did the schoolteacher want the books for? What was the library's most frequently borrowed title? What was she reading herself? When he rode back into Ridgeback on a Thursday afternoon in late January, Pauline was in the middle of serving 3 customers and could not abandon the counter without being rude. She was professional about it. She completed the transactions. She waited until the last customer left. And then she came around the counter and crossed the floor and walked directly into his arms, and he closed them around her, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and breathed. "I missed you," she said, into his coat. "I know," he said, his chin against her hair. "I missed you with a completeness that surprised me, and I have been thinking about nothing else for the last 4 days." "Good," she said. "That seems appropriate." He laughed, and it was the warm, genuine laugh she had come to love, and she felt it against her cheek where she was pressed to his chest. February was the month Frederick asked her to marry him, which he did in the simplest possible way, he asked. No grand gesture, no elaborate preparation. They were sitting at the back table after supper, with the library shelves around them and a lamp burning low between them and the night wind making its low sound around the building's corners. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked up from her book. "Go ahead." "Pauline Whitaker," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him. At the honest, steady face she had come to know as thoroughly as she knew her own, at the careful gray-green eyes that had been looking at her with complete and open attention since the first morning he walked into her store, at the man who had asked her everything, who had not stopped asking, who had made a world of questions into a home that she lived in. "Yes," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small inset garnet, which was the exact kind of ring she would have chosen herself if anyone had asked her. Which she supposed was the point. He had asked her about her tastes and her preferences in the accumulated wealth of every conversation they had ever had, and then he had listened. "It fits," she said when he put it on her finger. "I asked Margaret what size to order," he said. "Of course you did," she said, and she started to laugh and could not quite stop. They were married in March, in the Ridgeback church on a Sunday morning when the desert was just beginning to show the first tentative signs of spring, tiny yellow flowers at the base of the creosote bushes, and the mountains to the west holding their snow on top while their lower slopes warmed. Margaret Chen stood with Pauline. The circuit preacher, a cheerful man named Brother Alcott who made the rounds of the southern Nevada towns, performed the service with evident pleasure. Pauline wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had owned for several years, and had always thought she might wear for something worth the occasion, and had a small bunch of dried lavender and sage that Clara had made for her. Frederick wore his dark coat, properly brushed, and a new white shirt, and looked at Pauline throughout the ceremony with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that the woman sitting in the front pew, Margaret Chen, made no effort whatsoever to conceal the fact that she was crying, which she would later characterize as dust in her eyes to anyone who brought it up. The Ridgeback minister read the vows, and Pauline and Frederick said them back to each other, and when Brother Alcott said, "You may kiss your bride," Frederick kissed her with the same quality of full attention that he had given every single thing since the day she had met him, and she kissed him back with everything she had been keeping inside her chest for 31 years, all the world she had carried alone until now. They walked out of the church into the spring desert light, and the small gathering of Ridgeback residents, 30 or 40 people who had come, which was most of the town, made a sound that was not quite applause and not quite cheering, but was something warm and communal and entirely genuine. Clara Reeve threw rice. Margaret Chen watched with the expression of a woman who has seen something she will remember for the rest of her life. Spring deepened into summer, and summer was everything Pauline had never permitted herself to expect. Frederick completed his commission work in the county and negotiated a permanent posting in Nevada, which meant that Ridgeback would be his home base while he traveled for cases, sometimes gone for a week or two, but always coming back. He set up a proper office in the rooms above the store, next to the living quarters where Pauline had slept alone for years, and the sound of another person moving in the adjacent room in the evenings was a sound she had not known she was listening for until it was there. The store continued to grow. The lending library expanded to over 200 books by summer's end, and the mail-order service had clients as far away as the California border. 2 new businesses opened in Ridgeback, a proper hardware merchant and a small restaurant run by a family who had come up from Arizona, and the town was acquiring the texture of somewhere that was actually going somewhere, rather than the stalled, scared quality it had worn for years under Silas Drum's shadow. News came from Carson City in June that Silas Drum had been convicted on 3 of the 5 charges against him and sentenced to 5 years in the federal penitentiary. Harlan Webb had testified against him in exchange for a lighter sentence of his own and was no longer in Ridgeback. The new county sheriff was a man named Prentice who was not, so far as anyone could determine, in anyone's pocket, which was a remarkable and welcome novelty. On a hot August evening, when the desert held the day's heat long after dark and the stars were thick overhead, Pauline sat on the store's porch with a glass of water and the geological survey Frederick had given her for Christmas, which she was rereading for the 3rd time because there was a great deal in it, and she kept finding new things. Frederick sat beside her, working in the journal she had given him, which was more than half full now with the questions he had asked and the answers he had received and some of what was in between. "What are you writing?" she asked. "Everything," he said, which was, she understood, exactly true. In September, she told him she was pregnant. He was very still for a moment, and then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, something enormous and quiet and entirely new, like a landscape scene for the first time. "How do you feel?" he said, which was exactly the right question. "Terrified," she said honestly, "and very happy." "Me too," he said. "Both of those exactly." The pregnancy was straightforward. Dr. Horace, who served the southern Nevada County Circuit, came through Ridgeback every 6 weeks and pronounced everything normal. Pauline continued to work in the store through the whole of it, which surprised some people and surprised her not at all, because the store was hers, and she was not the kind of woman who stopped in the middle of a thing. Frederick was, throughout those months, the most present and attentive person she had ever encountered, which was not easy to improve upon given what he had been before. He asked her constantly how she was feeling, not in the anxious, repetitive way of someone who doesn't know what to do with the answer, but in the genuine, interested way of a man who wants to know. He read everything available on the subject, which in 1883 was not comprehensive but was what existed, and applied the information with characteristic thoroughness. He made sure she slept enough and ate enough and did not carry heavy things by herself, not because he thought she was incapable but because he was capable too, and there was no reason she should do everything alone. In March of 1884, exactly 1 year after their wedding, their son was born. They named him James Frederick Covington, for 2 fathers, one gone and one present. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in a considerable hurry, as though having decided that the outside world was worth the trouble of getting to. Dr. Horace was there. Margaret Chen was there, having appointed herself in the general category of necessary support without asking anyone's permission. Clara Reeve ran the store for the day and sent a note up saying everything was under control, and would Mrs. Covington please not worry about a single thing. Pauline held her son in the bright March morning, with the spring desert light coming through the window, and looked at the small, furious face of this person who had arrived out of nowhere and already seemed entirely himself, and felt something expand inside her that she had not known could expand further. Frederick sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at his son with the geological survey expression, the landscape scene for the first time. He reached out one finger, and the baby's hand closed around it with the absolute, unconsidered trust of a person who has never had any reason to believe the world would not hold him. "James," Frederick said softly. "He has your eyes," Pauline said, the strange gray-green already visible even this early. "He has your forehead," Frederick said, very determined. "He's 5 minutes old," she said. Already, he said. She laughed, and it hurt from the effort of the morning, and she didn't care. She looked at her husband and her son and the spring desert and the lending library that could be heard downstairs where Clara was receiving the day's customers, and she thought about what it felt like to have lived her whole life in one place. She had an answer now that she hadn't had before. It felt like it had been preparation. All 31 years of it, the work and the loneliness and the fear and the reading and the learning and the endurance, had been the work of becoming the person who was ready for all of this. For the land claim and the fight and the man who arrived on a gray mare and asked her everything. For this room, this morning, this small, fierce person with his grandfather's name and his father's eyes. Summer came again, and James was 3 months old and beginning to have opinions about everything, which Pauline found entirely charming and Frederick found absolutely delightful. He had taken to carrying the baby in a sling arrangement that Clara had sewn, which allowed him to continue working at his desk while James slept against his chest. And the sight of this, her husband, the federal land agent with his federal reports, with a sleeping infant tucked against his coat, was one of the most quietly extraordinary things Pauline had ever seen. The store continued to be the best version of itself. The mail-order book service had expanded enough that she hired a second assistant, a man named Hollis who handled the shipping correspondence and the heavier deliveries. The lending library now had 312 volumes and a waiting list for the most popular titles. Margaret Chen had been officially contracted to supply the store's small reading area with coffee on weekend mornings, which had been her idea, and which Pauline had agreed to immediately because it was an excellent idea, and because Margaret's coffee was worth doing anything to facilitate. Frederick's commission work brought him into contact with other land disputes in the region, some of which had happier resolutions than others, but he carried all of them with the same steady principle he carried everything, doing what could be done, refusing to be worn down by what couldn't, coming home to Ridgeback with the specific quality of a man who knows where home is. In the evenings, when James was put to sleep in the small bedroom that had been her father's old office and was now the most important room in the building, and the store was closed and the desert went quiet outside, Pauline and Frederick would sit together in the way they had always sat, at the same table with their separate work, comfortable in the shared silence. Sometimes he would ask her a question. Sometimes she would ask him one. The journal he had kept all year was now one of several, all of them on the shelf in the office above the store, a record of everything they had asked each other and everything they had answered. On an October evening that was cool and clear, 1 year after the night Silas Drum had come into the store with his hired men and his ultimatum, Pauline looked up from her ledger and looked at Frederick across the lamplit table and thought about that night, about the specific moment when she had made the choice to tell the truth and everything had changed. She had been afraid that night. She had been afraid in a way that had nothing to do with the gun or Silas Drum, and everything to do with Frederick, with the possibility of his being harmed, with the sudden, bright, terrible understanding of how much she had come to need him in the weeks preceding. She had not had the language for it then, had not let herself name it, but looking back she understood that the terror of that evening had been the terror of love recognized at the worst possible moment. "What are you thinking about?" Frederick said, looking up from his papers. "October of last year," she said. He was quiet for a moment, knowing what she meant. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. I'm grateful." "So am I," he said. "I keep trying to find the right word for it," she said. "What this year has been, what all of this is. What do you arrive at?" he said. She thought about it. About the store and the library and the land claim and the questions and the wedding and James and the evenings and the journal and all of it, the accumulated weight of a year that had remade her life from the ground up. "Answered," she said finally. "It feels answered, like something that had been a question for a very long time." He looked at her across the lamp, with his strange gray-green eyes and his honest face and the full, undivided attention he had given her since the very first morning, and he said, I know exactly what you mean. They sat for a while in the comfortable quiet, and then he asked, "Are you happy?" Nobody had ever asked her that before. Not the way he asked it, not as a pleasantry, not as a rhetorical courtesy, but as a genuine, weighted question that wanted a genuine, weighted answer. She considered it carefully, the way she considered everything he asked. She looked at the room around her, the store ledger, the lamp, the shelf of journals, the sound of her son breathing in the next room, the man across the table who had decided to ask her everything and had not stopped. "Yes," she said. And it was true in every layer, not the simple happiness of a single good moment, but the deep, structural happiness of a life that had found its shape. "I am genuinely, completely happy." He reached across the table and took her hand. "So am I," he said. "I think that may be the most important thing I've ever confirmed." Outside, the desert held the last warmth of the day and the stars were beginning, and inside the lamp burned steady, and in the small bedroom James, Frederick Covington, dreamed his 3-month-old dreams in perfect peace. And Pauline Whitaker, Pauline Covington now, though she had kept the Whitaker for the store because it was her father's name and she was not giving it up, sat in the home she had always lived in and found it, for the first time, entirely enough. 2 years later, they had a daughter. They named her Ruth, which had been Pauline's mother's name, and she arrived in the springtime like her brother, and she had Pauline's dark eyes and Frederick's thoughtful expression, and right from the beginning looked at the world as though she had questions about it. James, who was 2.5, regarded his sister with the careful, proprietary interest of a firstborn who has not yet decided whether this development is acceptable. Within a week, he had decided it was. He was, even at 2, his father's son in the sense that he liked to understand things, and once he understood that Ruth was permanent and his and interested in him, he accepted her completely. The store grew. The library grew. The town grew because the water rights being properly held meant that the Eastern Basin farms remained viable, and viable farms meant families, and families meant a town that was actually becoming a town rather than slowly fading into the desert. A school was built in 1886, which meant Clara's young daughter would have somewhere to go. A second doctor joined the circuit. The stage line added a twice-weekly service. Frederick's commission work eventually ended. The commission was restructured in 1887, and the Nevada cases were folded into the federal land office in Carson City. But by then it didn't matter because he had been offered and accepted a position as a deputy federal land registrar based out of Ridgeback itself. It was less traveling, more desk work, and he adapted to it with the same methodical competence he applied to everything. He also, gradually and without intending to, became the person that people in the surrounding county came to with land questions, land disputes, documentation problems. The trusted, knowledgeable man at the store who would look at your papers and tell you honestly what you had and what you needed to do about it. He was good at it. He was good at it in the way that Pauline was good at the store, not through natural talent alone, but through the combination of talent and care, which was the only kind of goodness that lasted. On a Saturday in the autumn of 1888, when James was 4 and Ruth was 2, and the library had 600 books and the store had been expanded into the building next door, Frederick sat down at the back table and opened a new journal. He wrote on the first page for a while and then he looked up. "What?" Pauline said, from where she was arranging a new display near the window. "I was trying to think of something I haven't asked you yet," he said. She turned. She looked at him. In 6 years of knowing him, he had asked her everything she had ever thought of, and a great many things she hadn't, and she was still, regularly, surprised by him. "And what do you think Ruth will ask her first question about?" he said. "When she gets to asking questions." Pauline thought about her daughter, the dark, watching eyes, the expression of assessment, the habit she already had of studying things before touching them. "Everything," she said. "She's going to ask about everything." Frederick smiled, the full, genuine smile she loved, the one that had appeared on his face for the first time on that rainy Thursday morning in 1882, and that she hoped she would be looking at across this table for the next 50 years. "Good," he said. "So she should." Outside, the desert was going gold in the late afternoon, and the spring mountains held their distant, beautiful indifference to the west, and everything beneath them had been moving slowly for millions of years. Inside the store that was a library and a life, the lamp was burning, and the questions kept coming, and they were home.